This is Cold Star, Tales from the Spine, where the Milky Way meets Andromeda. Narrated as a single voice. Sit back, keep your coffee ready, real coffee, if you're lucky, and listen. My name is Ned Valen. I remember thinking, once, that taste was a small thing. Survival was measured in fuel, credits, and who kept their hands clean. Taste seemed sentimental then, a luxury for shore leave in ports that now exist only as memory. Now, after produce and the quarantine nights, taste had become an urgent ache. Not the reheated sludge we call cold coffee out of stubborn pride, no, the honest kind, beans that knew rain, soil that held stories, a roast that makes your chest remember something it had decided to forget. Rumors travel the spine like smoke. This time the rumor led to Pomona Fields, a ring colony of hydroponic domes and tied-together green belts, a place where agronomists had married old Earth techniques with orbital engineering. Pomona had been named for a gardener god in the old tales, and names mattered there. People who thought about crops named things carefully. The Ceres Guild, their cooperative, treated cultivation as ritual. Coffee was culture. Coffee was a covenant. We set course because it was the thing I wanted more than anything that night, a cup that would make me remember why I kept going. The Argus slid through the dark like a barnacle-heavy barge and we joked, badly, about whether gods preferred espresso or drip. Mika said it was chemistry and variables, Lee said it was history and taste, I said nothing, only wondered if my tongue still had the map to what I once loved. Pomona arrived as bands of green and glass against a ring of dark. The domes glowed faintly and the air smelled of damp leaves and engineered nutrients, in a good way. The Ceres Guild met us in a communal bay where the air tasted faintly salty because the ring harvested tidal minerals in its cycles. Leaders there were gentle but guarded. They learned quickly who we were, and they learned faster why we were asking for coffee. The coop didn't sell their best, they traded it for work, for service, for friendship. Real coffee was not a commodity, it was a promise. They offered us 3 ways: earn a quota through labor, provide something of cultural value, or buy from the black market. The last option tasted like credits and regret. Argus was low on credits, and I had seen what selling a culture's flavor to the highest bidder did to a place. So we worked. The job was to repair an old ion pump in a far dome whose automation had failed. Mika loved the chants, he calls that sound the music of torque. Lise did the planning, she always moved in halves and knots, keeping threads from pulling apart. The pump looked like a beaten instrument, oxidized conduits, algae growth in insulating seams, and a control that trusted the hands of those who once designed it. We fixed the pump slowly, with gloves, conversation, and the occasional swear. While we worked, the coop's agronomist, a man named Pomponius, told stories about fermentation and flavor like an old priest telling psalms. Pomponius was not young, and he walked with the slow certainty of hands that have touched soil for decades. He explained things in ways that made sense even to my blunt mind. Taste, he said, is not an atom but a web: sunlight, salt, microbes, harvest timing, night air, and the way human hands handle the bean all contribute. Pomponius used phrases like nighttide fermentation and salt bloom, and my interest sharpened in ways that surprised me. The chemical part he explained plainly: microbes alter sugars, produce esters and phenols, things a tongue reads as citrus, floral, or savory, but he always ended with the story of the people who touched the beans. While we repaired, nature kept its own work. Pomona's ecology was not ornamental, it was active and opinionated. There were 2 local species that made themselves known to us that week, and both nearly spoiled our deal if we treated them like curios rather than partners. First were the chemic ants, a colony of large, chemically processing ants that had evolved a metabolism based on local salts and organic resources. They were not insects in the exact Earth sense, but analogous, social, industrious, with specialized glands that secreted acidic enzymes used to break down tough plant fibers. They functioned as living bioreactors for the farms, they processed waste, composted biomass, and enriched the substrate with a complex bouquet of aromatic esters. Think of them as tiny industrial organisms that both cleaned and flavored in one chew. Mika was openly delighted. He took samples, labeled them, and muttered about the potential for converting their metabolic pathways into a microbioreactor that could enhance any roast. Lise warned caution, they are part of a system, not a tool. She always spoke that way when she wanted us to be careful without taking the joy out of discovery. The ants were communal and sensitive to vibration and chemistry. They staged their work like ceremony, millions of jaws coordinating, moving waste into fermentation nodes. When they worked well, the air smelled of warm nuts and a salt tang, and I could almost taste that in a cup. The trouble began when some visiting traders tried to aggressively clean a fruit store with industrial solvents. The solvents hit a batch of chemic ant processing nodes and the ants responded with a defensive secretion, a protease cocktail that, when it contacted certain parts of the bean's surface, accelerated a set of esterifications. The result was a crate of beans that turned unexpectedly savory, crossing into intense umami that Pomponius called, with something like pride and horror at once, sea chocolate. For some tasters it was revelation, for purists it was a violation. For us, with our eyes on a quota, it meant some of the beans were suddenly of ambiguous value. The second oddity was the walking plants, the locals called them roamers. They were not animals, they were flora that had developed limited locomotion to follow nutrient pulses in the tidal cycles. Imagine stalks with segmented joints, small gripping pads instead of roots, and photosynthetic flaps that unfurled like sails. They walked slowly, centimeter by centimeter, seeking richer substrate when tides or nutrient flows changed. Biologically plausible? Yes, in a high-energy environment mobility can be adaptive for sessile organisms, and Pomona's tidal mixing made movement beneficial. One young roamer mistook the warmth of our repair lights for a bloom and ambled into a nursery rack. It proved gentle in its curiosity, but clumsy. It chose the largest cherries and plucked them with a delicate appendage. Mika laughed as it sampled a roasted bean. I felt an immediate parental guilt. The plant, in its slow way, had salted and sweetened its own harvest with surface enzymes, changing the flavor profile of those cherries. So when we came to bargaining, our batch was mixed, prime beans, sea chocolate anomalies, and a small portion handled by roaming plants. Pomponius did not care much for trade math when he appreciated the ecology, he wanted the right markets and the right hands to taste each variant. We bargained. We earned a modest quota in exchange for the pump repair and for teaching a maintenance trick to some young apprentices, Mika's favorite part. Lise got the cooperative's assurance that our assistance was honored as reciprocity, not exploitation. The community trade felt honest, which mattered. On our way back to the Argus, we packed the beans with ritual. 2/3 were hermetically sealed and recorded as cultural exchange samples in the manifest, educational, rather than exportable foodstuff. 1/3 we designated for crew and a handful of named guests. I kept a small private portion, my selfish treasure. Because I learned long ago that some memories must be tasted, not catalogued. But Prometheus never sleeps. The corporation had been watching the ripples from Elysium, its analysts noticed anomalies. Their risk models favored novelty, unusual agricultural outputs raised curiosity. A representative, not an inspector so much as a corporate envoy, shadowed our slip as we departed. He was smooth and smelled faintly of disinfectant and office coffee. He asked the right questions about exotic samples. He was not stupid. He was a man who could turn curiosity into procurement with the right paperwork and the correct pressure. So we did 2 things. First, we hid most of the cargo properly, sealed, contextualized, labeled as cultural artifacts for study. Second, I did something I've not done for a long while, I recorded a voice log and tucked it inside a rarely scanned section of ship memory. I said, softly and perhaps foolishly, if this coffee tells a truth, let it be that some things deserve guardians, not markets. It felt a little like writing a last will that could bloom into hope. If you ask about the trip home, you'll hear talk of skyfish. We'd seen the creatures before, translucent, ion skeletal bodies that drift in the upper atmospheres of gas giants and feed on charge. They are beautiful and useless in a port sense. But they love harmonics. Our test burn with the new magnetite coils played a note the Argus had never sung before, and something in the ionosphere tuned to it. When a skyfish found a thruster note delicious, it didn't bite so much as lap and wrap itself in the wake. Picture a winged jellyfish slapping against the aft and leaving shimmering slime. We lost an hour, half a coil's worth of magnetite under a biofilm, and Mika had to improvise a shim out of duct and prayer. We learned, again, that space is not only engineered void, it's full of life and hunger in odd forms. The fish left blue-green streaks and a solemn Mika, who called it a dietary misallocation. Lees labeled the ruined coil bad memories and put it in quarantine. Prometheus's envoy left us with a polite file and a follow-up note. He didn't take the beans. For now. He had professional patience. That's the sort of patience that builds ledgers. Back in the mess, coffee tastes different when you made the cup from something the crew and a whole cooperative earned together. I roasted my small share myself in a battered skillet because proper roasters weren't allowed in our galley. The smell filled the galley like a liturgy. My first cup was warm and precise and bitter in the way that says the world is still solid. There was salt in the aftertaste, sea and soil and the odd sea chocolate note that made me brace and laugh. For a heartbeat I was younger and braver. For a heartbeat, memory and present met. We also made choices for safety. We encoded the manifest and a safe log. The documentation told a plausible story of cultural exchange, of educational samples being transported under the guidance of the Ceres Guild. We devised a patient cryptic watermark for the ship's ledger, a rhythm only someone who knows the cooperative's patterns would parse. It was lying with tenderness. I have always liked that kind of lie. That night I recorded another soft log and hid it deep in the whole memory. If you find this, I said, be gentle. This came from hands who farmed it as ritual, not profit. It was sentimental and useless and entirely necessary. You wonder at the end if it was worth it. We paid in magnetite, in a ruined coil, in time. We paid in a hazardous exposure to corporate attention. But for one evening in the mess, with a cup that tasted of wind and soil and a plant's curious nibble, I remembered something I did not know I had lost, the capacity to feel small joy. The crew slept poorly. Mika dreamed of breeding chemic ants in his lab. Lees wrote a quiet note in her book about how communities guard taste. I drank the last of my ration in shifts, savoring each swallow like contraband. In the weeks that followed, Prometheus poked. They sent a polite request for sample verification. They did not yet send hounds. The Argus kept on slipping. The ring of Pomona stayed green and, for now, whole. What had struck me, and this is what Pomponius said with a smile that carried both grief and pride, is that flavor is co-created. The chemic ants, the roaming plants, the tide, Pomponius and his people, they all contributed to the taste. Take one element out, and you take the story out. Someone who patents a microbe for a flavor is not stealing a taste, they are stealing a narrative and the right of a people to feed themselves with dignity. That is something Prometheus doesn't price into their spreadsheets. I tucked the rest of the beans under layers and codes. I told Mika to roast a small test batch for the apprentices when it was safe. Lees designed a small misdirection in the manifest that would buy time. We had the coffee. We had scrapes and gratitude. We had a story. In the long run, maybe we planted a small seed of trouble. Prometheus will not forget odd outputs. The sea chocolate anomaly would be interesting to a lab and tempting to a patent office. But for tonight, for a small quiet while, we drank warmth that was real. A cup taught me that kindness might be patient, that taste is worth guarding, and that sometimes a man chooses a slightly illegal kindness because the world handed him grief and called it policy. That was episode 3, The Hunt for Real Coffee. We patched parts, learned how life tastes, fought bureaucratic curiosity with a calm ledger and a softer lie, and found a cup that made the night tolerable. Next time, Ember reach in a sky of red storms, where old debts and new enemies might finally catch up to us. Keep your cup warm when you can, and your conscience warmer. If coffee is a small salvation, protect it. If you ever taste sea chocolate, tell no one unless they deserve the truth. End.